Early in the 1992 presidential campaign, the underdog in the New York primary arrived at the Sheraton Hotel for an Irish-American forum.
I was exhausted. It was late at night, and it was almost like I was being put through an oral exam for a PhD in Irish politics.
I wasn't expecting much, because I had never heard a national politician in America say anything but the most banal or non-controversial things about Ireland. It was either I wore a green tie on St. Patrick's Day, or my cousin came from Killarney.
There were lots of questions, and they weren't exactly hostile, but they were highly aggressive.
Governor Clinton, my first question has to do with the area of visa denial and a policy.
So you have Martin Galvin, who was, in a way, the voice of the IRA of the United States. You have a guy running for president of the United States talking about Gerry Adams, who, in the British eyes, was this arch-terrorist.
If you were elected president, would you direct the State Department to allow a visa to Gerry Adams?
So here Galvin bores in on the ultimate question, the visa question. I had the feeling that we ought to try to do something.
I want to give you a precise answer to your question. I would support a visa for Gerry Adams. I think it would be totally harmless to our national security interest, and it might be enlightening to the political debate in this country.
I'm not sure at the time I understood all the ramifications of what I had said.
He committed himself to supporting a visa for Gerry Adams, actually without the advice of his foreign policy team. It came as something of a surprise to us. And all of us in early '93 recommended against giving Adams such a visa because IRA terrorism was continuing.
Terrorist bombs in the City of London were the latest escalation of a conflict that had erupted in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and that had killed almost 3,500 people. For 25 years, the IRA had fought to drive the British out and unite the 6 northern counties with the Republic of Ireland. The British Army fought to support the wish of the majority in the north, the Unionists, to remain within the United Kingdom. To the British government, Gerry Adams was just the political voice of a terrorist group.
I am glad of the opportunity to pay tribute to the freedom fighters, to the men and women volunteers of the IRA.
In 1993, the British and Irish Prime Ministers issued a joint declaration. It dangled a distant prospect of a united Ireland before the IRA, to tempt them to call a ceasefire.
The door is open to them. They won't have a better opportunity, and they don't have a better option. Our message is clear and it is simple. There is no future in violence.
The voices of all spokesmen for Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, were banned from British television. For 4 years, Gerry Adams' TV appearances had been dubbed with an actor's voice.
This media, a banned media, a censored media, using an actor's voice is no way and no means of communication. Why can't Mr. Major engage with us in private if need be to move things forward?
We had signed the joint declaration, but he hadn't supported it. He was equivocating on it and demanding clarifications, but he expressly hadn't supported it. He hadn't renounced violence. It never occurred to me that he would get a visa. I saw no conceivable reason why he should.
John Major persuaded the new president that Britain knew best. In his first year in office, Clinton refused 2 visa applications from Gerry Adams. But the Irish Americans who had helped Clinton into the White House didn't give up. They proposed to visit Belfast.
I had information from my own contacts over here that Sinn Féin were interested in a new departure in America, in opening up the possibility of an American intervention in Northern Ireland.
The Irish Americans decided to ask for an IRA ceasefire to impress the White House.
They clearly indicated before they came that it would be most helpful if a period of quiet could be arranged to facilitate their arrival, their visit. And we went off to see what we could do in relation to all of that.
In Belfast, the IRA agreed a 10-day ceasefire for the visit, though they did not announce it. The Irish Americans arrived knowing that high on Sinn Féin's agenda was a visa for Gerry Adams. Adams welcomed them with his colleague Martin McGuinness.
Martin McGuinness said to us that he had been stopped on his way, that he had been harassed, and that he wanted to make it clear that we were in a war zone. The helicopters were overhead, that 30,000 British troops were on the streets, and that things were very tough in his community.
The one message I wanted to convey was that the label terrorist was drowning out their entire message. That was my experience as a member of Congress. And so somehow that had to change. And in my view, the way that changed was what the IRA had just done for our visit, which was stop.
Sinn Féin's leaders explained that the IRA would stop their war only if they believed they could get more from Britain through politics. They needed the American government's backing to strengthen their hand.
We had shared objectives. We were people looking to develop the international dimension, particularly in the USA. They were people from that constituency looking to make a contribution.
We talked about visas for Gerry Adams and for leading Sinn Féin representatives. We talked about opening our own office in Washington, and we talked about how we could make all of that happen.
I said I thought we could deliver the White House. I wasn't quite sure in what guise, but I said I was confident that we could deliver the White House for the first time in the history of the Irish conflict.
All the world is bright and gay.
But the White House wasn't yet ready to welcome Gerry Adams. The president had consulted the most powerful Irish-American dynasty.
I was against the visa. I've been strongly opposed to the IRA and violence, and had maintained that position in the United States Senate.
The president marked St. Patrick's Day by appointing a new ambassador to the Republic of Ireland, Jean Kennedy Smith, Senator Kennedy's sister. Ireland's Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, had made it his mission to get an IRA ceasefire. Now he decided the next step towards this goal was a US visa for Gerry Adams.
I was going to give it all I had to try and get him. He was banned out of New York, and if we could get him in and be seen to win a diplomatic argument on the world stage supported by Washington, if Washington were going to support us, it would have been a big step forward.
That Christmas, Senator Kennedy visited his sister in Dublin, and the Taoiseach seized his chance.
We talked that night about the whole situation, and he was surprised to hear about me changing government policy to go and support a visa for Gerry Adams, because he had been implacably opposed to it.
I remember asking him whether he was absolutely personally convinced, to a moral certainty, that Gerry Adams was against violence and for moving the political process forward. And he spent a good deal of time telling me how he came to this conclusion.
We discussed why Adams shouldn't be asked to give up terrorism before he's allowed into the United States. And the argument from the Taoiseach was very persuasive in that he felt that the big thing that Gerry Adams wanted to avoid was a split within the Republican movement. And he knew that at this time he did not have the power to dictate to the IRA that they were going to go the path of peace.
In New York, the Irish-American group stepped up the pressure. They organized a peace conference as a pretext to invite Gerry Adams to America. Senator Kennedy wrote to the White House, backing the visa.
The letter from Ted Kennedy had an enormous impact on the White House and our decision to move things forward.
It wasn't until 3 days before the conference that the visa application reached the president.
It was a Saturday afternoon. I just had this wonderful lunch with Helmut Kohl, who loves to eat, and so do I, so we had a big time. And I came in, I thought, now I'm going to spoil my meal with indigestion. I was feeling kind of crabby, actually, but anxious to get through this.
The president called in his national security team.
Well, we knew we had to make a decision, and they all knew I wanted to do it because I wanted to encourage the process. Albert Reynolds wanted me to do it. The State Department was dead against it. You know, the career people in the State Department thought it would be devastating to our special relationship with Great Britain. The Justice Department was against it because they thought it would look like we were coddling terrorism.
Before the president could make a decision, came a bolt from the blue. A radio station in San Diego received a message. A group calling itself the South California IRA claimed responsibility for bombs planted in British businesses. They warned there would be more if Gerry Adams did not get his visa.
I felt I was snake bit. I thought, my God, here, how could this happen? And why would they do something so stupid if they did it?
All of us initially thought this probably puts the kibosh on the whole thing.
Then it turned out they were hoax bombed, but you know, somebody did something and said something. So I felt that Gerry Adams had to make some sort of statement condemning it.
In New York, the organizers of the peace conference were desperate to find out if their star guest was coming.
I just literally was running the shower, and I'm sitting there stark naked, and the phone rings, and I grab a towel.
I told him, but it would very much help us if you could get Adams to renounce this incident.
I said, you've got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me. I'm going to call up Gerry Adams and tell him that, you know, he has to deny the San Diego IRA. And I said, what did they do? They go around on surfboards?
He had the very difficult task of waking Mr. Adams up, telling him he had to renounce something that he's never heard of by a group he's never heard of.
It was well after midnight his time, and he gets up out of bed feeling quite grumpy and sleepy, and I say to him, Gerry, just one little bit of business. And he said, what is it? Very suspiciously.
But he went on to say that I would have to condemn what he referred to as the San Diego IRA. And I was a bit taken aback by this.
And he said, does this mean that every time an Irish guy gets drunk in America and hits an Englishman that I have to apologize for it? I said, probably, but I mean, we need to deal with this one right now.
Gerry Adams quickly issued a press release condemning the so-called San Diego IRA.
I thought the statement was adequate, so I called Christopher and told him I wanted to do it.
But the Secretary of State had not changed his mind.
He thought it was a terrible mistake. He thought we would do irreparable damage to our relationship with the British. He knew we needed the British because we were trying even then to desperately to get consensus among our allies in Europe to do something in Bosnia, and that in a larger sense that the United States would lose for years a relationship without which we cannot conduct the foreign policy of America insofar as Europe is involved. So the stakes were quite high.
Then the president's national security team weighed in.
Tony Lake and I presented this as actually a win-win decision for the situation. If he issued the visa to Gerry Adams and you had a ceasefire, obviously that was a win for everyone involved. If he issued the visa and the ceasefire did not materialize, it would give us a very strong platform from which we could isolate Sinn Féin's influence in the United States and crack down on their support for activities related to violence, and that would be a win as well.
I thought it was worth the risk to push the peace process forward. Look, in all these places in the world, nobody would ever get anything done if no one ever took a chance.
He looked up and said, as he did when he had made tough decisions, okay, let's do it.
We had a phone call from the White House saying that the president had granted a visa to Gerry Adams. I was frankly astonished. I mean, it was our clear understanding that there wasn't going to be a visa, and I had no understanding of why that position had been changed.
Welcome to Larry King Live. Tonight, the New York visit of a man so controversial his very voice is barred from English television. The political leader of the Irish Republican Army, Gerry Adams.
Gerry, why do you think they released that long-standing ban against you and let you come in?
Well, I think it's an indication of the concern of President Clinton that US opinion should be informed about what's happening in Ireland. I don't have cloven hooves or two horns. And when people see that, they're pleasantly surprised. So extreme had the British been in the way they had sought to marginalise us, that just having a human form was a coup for Sinn Féin.
Also at the conference was Northern Ireland's most famous peacemaker, John Hume, who had worked for years to bring Gerry Adams and Sinn Féin into the political arena.
Sitting in the Waldorf with Gerry Adams and others was of course quite important, because it was evidence that normal politics was starting at last.
At the conference itself, all the cameras came forward, thrust right into Gerry Adams' face. And there was John Hume sitting on his own. No camera bothered with them. They all just focused right in on Gerry, every camera.
Those of us who were meeting Gerry there were never allowed to think we'd finished our work. Now it just gets harder. The president has taken a big risk. He's being criticized by some members of Congress. The British embassy in Washington is going completely bananas. And now it can't just have been a one-off trip to New York. Now there has, now what? Now ceasefire.
Gerry Adams returned to a Northern Ireland that was still at war. To the IRA, after 25 years of fighting, it remained an occupied zone. The Sinn Féin leadership used their triumph in America to press fellow Republicans to consider a ceasefire.
I said to people that it was my view that it should happen. I made the case very clearly.
What he was saying was that the armed struggle had gone as far as it could go, and that it was now time to let Sinn Féin pursue the situation that the IRA couldn't win and the British Army couldn't win, and that virtually they had come to a stalemate, military stalemate.
We could create a situation where the Taoiseach, Gerry Adams and John Hume, supported by opinion in Irish America and ultimately by the White House, could effectively present the British government and the leadership with the unionist parties with a fait accompli. In other words, that they would have no choice but to engage in inclusive negotiations.
Within their own enclaves, like the Cregan estate in Derry, the IRA were in control. But for many in the movement, political negotiations were uncharted territory.
A lot of us were unhappy. We didn't trust the British for a start. We were worried that they would split us, manipulate us, and drive a wedge through us. And the big worry for a lot of us activists on the ground was that the army would split.
To reassure their activists, Adams and his colleagues began to compile a shopping list of the benefits a ceasefire would bring.
We at leadership level put together what I called a package. And then, if and when we got the package, the IRA had to take its decision.
But all this was taking time. 5 months after he had stuck his neck out for Gerry Adams' visa, the Taoiseach was getting impatient. With no sign of a ceasefire, his credibility was on the line.
I sent word to the Republican leadership that if I didn't have a positive decision about an announcement of a ceasefire before the holidays were out, that I was going away for 3 weeks holidays, and if I didn't have it by the time I came back, I was going to pull down the shutters on the whole project.
To deliver this ultimatum to Sinn Féin, Reynolds sent his advisor Martin Manser to an isolated monastery near the border.
I found them in a very practical oriented mood and essentially that the decision had been made. I'm not saying in formal terms, but just you know, mentally the decision had been made, and it was a question of choreographing the next few weeks.
Well, I told Martin Mansell that it was absolutely vital that the Irish government pressed for demilitarisation, that this would show people effectively on the ground at grassroots level that there was fundamental change going to take place to their lives. We discussed the issue of prisoners and different things which the Irish government could do in relation to improving the atmosphere and creating the very clear impression that, if you like, nationalist Ireland had got its act together.
To get their act together, Sinn Féin called a special conference. It took place on the Irish side of the border because some of their activists were wanted by the police in Northern Ireland.
Ceasefire talk was very much in the air, and was this going to lead to a ceasefire? And I suppose there was concerns and worries and fears amongst Republicans about that, and what would that mean, and were the British trying to outmaneuver, which of course they were, Irish Republicans.
People listened. There was a lot of apprehension, a lot of excitement, a lot of wonder. You know, a lot of, are we going to be told the ceasefire is on tomorrow night, you know?
The conference was a piece of Republican theatre. In front of the cameras, Sinn Féin leaders took a tough line.
And we placed the onus firmly on the British government as the root cause of the conflict.
But behind the scenes, they spread the word that the Irish government had responded positively to their demands.
I remember in the evening of the conference when it was over, going down to Ramelton, which is just a few miles from Letterkenny. There was a few restaurants over there. Jerry said to me, we should get a table together. There's something back here from the Irish government. And he gave me their response, which was, I read it and I thought, that sounds like the stuff we sent to them. And he says, jokingly, well, there you are now, they've responded.
I had succeeded in getting a visa for Adams. I had announced that there would be a parole of prisoners and a total review of their prison sentences, that I would try and convince the British government to do the same, that I had lifted the ban on interviews on radio and television for Sinn Féin, and there was very little else left to me to offer, and that it was make up your mind time.
But instead of a ceasefire, Adams sent Reynolds a new demand, a US visa for a convicted murderer who had been caught red-handed smuggling 5 tons of Libyan arms to the IRA, Joe Cahill. The IRA's star fundraiser, he had twice been deported by the US authorities.
Joe has a certain, and if I may say so, misplaced notoriety. He's a very genial old rebel, and we thought that it would test whether this was just a one-off with Gerry Adams or one or two of us.
He said this was vital if the ceasefire that we all wanted was going to come about. Vital for the reason that Sinn Féin and the Republican movement felt that they should have a credible spokesperson from here over in the United States to explain a change of direction in their policy.
The president was on vacation in Martha's Vineyard when the Taoiseach tracked him down and pleaded for one more favour, a visa for Joe Cahill.
The president said to me, "Did you read this man's CV?" And I said, "No, I didn't. I don't have to, because, I mean, I don't expect the IRA to be producing saints anyway, and never did."
I said, "Albert, what in the hell are you getting me into here?" You know, he says, "You got to do it, you got to do it. He'll be fine. He come here, he won't do anything wrong, he won't raise money for guns, he'll be fine."
And he says, "Well, I'm all at risk this time." I says, "We're all at risk. So is peace at risk."
I did require Reynolds to give me some details about exactly what they were going to say, because I didn't want to be in a position of being made to look like a fool.
A few hours later, Reynolds called back to give the president the exact words of the IRA statement.
The IRA will announce a complete cessation of military operations effective from midnight on Wednesday night. And I stopped there. And he says, "That seems clear enough to me." I says, "It's very clear. That's what it is, and that's what it means, and that's what will happen."
Anyway, I told him in rather graphic terms what my reaction would be if this didn't work out.
He says, "I never want to hear from you again if this one doesn't run. Goodbye."
Excuse me, could you let the gentleman through, please?
Can you give us any indication why you're in the States, sir?
How do you feel about being in New York? How was your flight? They treat you good?
There was a bar on 2nd Avenue in the 40s. We went in a side entrance, and when I looked in there, I saw everything from convicted gun runners to some Wall Street lawyers, and Joe Cahill's message to them was, just as you trusted us for the last 25 years, we're asking you to trust us as we go into this new phase.
They've been sensible people, and Joe being able to deliver on his briefing, and the very fact that he was there. See, that here was another example that this was working.
Belfast held its breath, believing an IRA ceasefire was imminent. Watching and waiting were paramilitaries with a different agenda. The Protestant Loyalists had been fighting to keep Northern Ireland inside the United Kingdom. They too had been arguing about a ceasefire.
I believe that the time wasn't right because the Loyalists, the Ulster Freedom Fighters, was having great successes against the Republican movement. These people had slaughtered our people and got away with it. And here we are, where we were getting it right, where we're just taking the war right till their doorstep, right till their leader's doorstep, from the top till the bottom, from Sinn Féin to IRA, scoring big time. Why call a ceasefire?
Other Loyalist leaders did want to get in on the peace process. An Irish peace campaigner with close links to the Foreign Ministry in Dublin received a summons to meet the Loyalist High Command.
We travelled through a couple of army checkpoints and police checkpoints, and I knew that as I was passing them, I was now going into an area where I was not going to be under anybody's protection, particularly the police or the army.
He was as nervous as hell. And why wouldn't he be? Here he was being driven to the Shankill Road, the heartland of the Empire.
There was lots of Loyalist paraphernalia, pictures of dead Loyalist comrades on the wall, and David Irvine said to me, now, the people you're going to meet are the two top people in the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force.
What they wanted was an avenue into the Irish government. And if he could provide that, that's what they were interested in.
So they said to me, well, look, we could offer a big prize. I asked him, what was that prize? And he says, peace. And I said, well, what do you mean by peace? And he said, a ceasefire.
If all we were hearing in the ether was real, that if the IRA were to call a ceasefire, I believed, and we believed, in other words, I'd been told to say it, that a Loyalist ceasefire was a serious possibility.
However, if there was any attempt to impose joint authority between Dublin and London, the Loyalist paramilitaries would orchestrate a campaign of violence that had not been seen before, which would involve serious attacks into the Republic.
On the 16th of June 1994, as the Loyalists edged towards a ceasefire, their high command were gathering at the UVF offices on the Shankill Road.
I heard a series of muffled cracks, which I wasn't sure whether it was gunfire or not, because we were inside. And someone came bursting through the door and said, Trevor's just been shot.
Outside, Loyalist commander Trevor King and two of his colleagues had been shot dead by Republicans.
We listened to the hysteria of the women, and it was almost surreal. I don't know that I thought at that time any more of than the brains and the blood, and the grey faces as the blood drained from those on the ground.
Retaliation seemed inevitable.
Mercurial, Roberto Baggio. Sheridan. Not easy, onto it comes Houghton. And Houghton with the shot, and it's there!
It was the summer of the World Cup, and in the first round, Ireland were playing Italy. In the quiet village of Loughin Island, fans had gathered in the pub when Loyalist gunmen walked in.
They were obviously all sitting watching the game,
And the gunmen obviously just came in, opened fire, and the bodies were piled on top of each other, and the people just were shot dead as they were sitting watching the game on TV. It's just beneath contempt of people who could carry out this type of thing.
There is a tit-for-tat battle going on out there, and somehow we must find a way out of this cycle.
Ray Smallwoods was one of the Loyalist military commanders seeking to persuade his colleagues that it was time for a ceasefire.
We must remove the conditions that feed violence.
And then the IRA killed Ray Smallwoods. And the same question again, what does this mean? Who are these people? I mean, what is it they really want? And I knew then, I mean, I knew before it. I knew before it that the Provost didn't factor in the Loyalists at all. And that Gerry Adams was meant to swan the world stage as a peacemaker.
By the end of August, Adams and McGuinness and the IRA had got their act together.
I was in the lounge and the phone rang, and it was Albert on the phone. And he said, I've got some very good news for you. He said, there's going to be a ceasefire, and it's a very solid decision, and it will be announced very shortly.
So, John says, we wait and see. I hope you're right.
For 36 hours, they waited.
The leadership of Oakley Ahern have decided that as of midnight, Wednesday, August 31st, there will be a complete cessation of military operations. All our units have been instructed accordingly.
We nearly shit ourselves. I think that day we did. You know, it was something you wanted, but what the hell? Here it comes. What are you going to do about it? What, you know, I'm not sure we knew what we were going to do about it, because we never still had got the answers about what is the British government intent? Are we shafted here? Are we being sold out?
To find out what the British government were up to, the Loyalists turned to their church.
They had come as a group, the Loyalist Military Command. These were the godfathers.
We wanted a guarantor. Robin EAMES was the guarantor.
They referred immediately to the IRA cessation. They immediately referred to the triumphalism as they interpreted it. And they said, we have two questions. Number one, has a deal been done with the IRA? Why are they feeling so triumphant? And secondly, where do we go from here?
The Archbishop took the questions straight to Downing Street.
I said, I am the Archbishop of Armagh. I'm trying to be a spiritual leader in a very difficult situation. You're the Prime Minister, elected Prime Minister of Great Britain, including Northern Ireland. I want you to give me a straight answer. Have you done a deal with the IRA?
And I said, Robin, you can go back and tell them categorically from me. You can say this publicly and privately. There has been no secret deal with the IRA.
Six weeks after the IRA ceasefire, it was the Loyalists' turn.
The combined Loyalist Military Command will universally cease all operational hostilities as from 12 midnight on Thursday, the 13th of October, 1994.
And for the first time, Northern Ireland heard a paramilitary apology.
In all sincerity, we offer to the loved ones of all innocent victims over the past 25 years abject and true remorse.
With all the guns silenced, the Unionist establishment would have no choice but to talk to the IRA's political wing. The Protestants had once enjoyed a monopoly of power, but since the start of the Troubles, their position had been eroding. Now they feared it would slide further. From the day the IRA called their ceasefire, the Unionist leaders began to stall.
It's a cessation of hostilities, that's all it is. And that isn't convincing, that's the problem. And I think that any fair-minded person would recognise that it's inadequate.
The IRA had agreed to a ceasefire, expecting that negotiations with the British government would follow quickly.
When I was asked, well, what would my estimate of the time frame be, I said, well, what about 3 years for decontamination?
In December, only 3 months after the IRA ceasefire, Sinn Féin set off for their first formal meeting with British civil servants. To add insult to the Unionists' injury, they met at Stormont, the former headquarters of Unionist supremacy, built as a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people.
The reason we arrived in the taxi is that it was a bulletproof vehicle, and it was the only one that we had at that time, and people saw it as an expression of our working class cred.
When I stood on the steps of Stormont, looking down the Grand Avenue that leads to the Newton Arch Road, I felt that we had taken ownership for the first time of the place, that we had arrived politically, and that we could build a new Ireland.
The British civil servants they were meeting saw Sinn Féin's arrival differently.
One of the questions which came up when we were preparing for exploratory dialogue was whether we should require the Sinn Féin delegation to pass through metal detectors. I suggested that this was a mistake and that we should treat Sinn Féin as we would treat the other members of the political parties we were dealing with, and that if Martin McGuinness was to come in and pull a gun and plug me, I would have to conclude that our analysis was based on a false premise.
I did regard it as something of a purgatory, simply because this was a process that we did have to go through.
Top of the British civil servants' agenda was the practical consequences of the ending of violence.
Both sides understood that the expression practical consequences of the ending of the violence referred to a number of things. It referred to arms and decommissioning. It probably referred to prisoners and to demilitarisation.
They were, in fact, setting tests for us to pass. They were starting to raise the issue of decommissioning.
In the course of our discussions, we obviously made it very clear that it was vitally important that we moved on as quickly as possible to negotiations, to an inclusive negotiated process, and that no obstacles should be put in the way.
Decommissioning, getting rid of the guns, would prove the obstacle that bedevilled the rest of the peace process. The British had raised decommissioning before, but Sinn Féin had not taken it seriously. At the first Anglo-Irish summit after the ceasefire, their resourceful ally, Albert Reynolds, believed he could handle it for them, but he faced a worried John Major.
Although a ceasefire had been declared, the IRA hadn't started dismantling their weapons. They hadn't stopped their normal activities. They were still setting up mortar positions. They were still conducting surveillance on British Army institutions to see when people went in and out.
I explained this to John Major. My party went into government and went into Parliament first, and they didn't hand over their guns to anybody. In fact, some of them brought their guns in their hip pockets going into the Parliament. So I couldn't have any credibility in asking the present leadership of Sinn Féin to hand over guns when our own party didn't hand them over, and all the other parties in government here didn't hand them over either.
But the Republicans were about to lose their most important ally.
I wish to announce to the Dáil that I intend to tender my resignation as Taoiseach and that of my ministers to the President.
At the end, I just left down the script, finished it off, and looked around and I said, it is amazing that you can cross all the large hurdles, but it's the small ones that trip you up.
The Taoiseach who had brokered the ceasefire had been brought down by a political row over a paedophile priest. It now fell to Ireland's Foreign Minister and Britain's Northern Ireland Secretary to work out the details of the framework documents that would form the agenda for all-party talks.
Immensely long negotiations took place, and I think I have to admit that on my side we got too much into the detail and stopped seeing the wood. I don't think we sufficiently saw what the wood would look like, and it turned out to be a very green wood indeed.
The sight of British and Irish ministers working so closely together alarmed the Unionists. John Major had to placate them.
I called Jim Molyneux in. I wished to show him the framework document, discuss it with him.
And he said, "This is it now." And I said, "It's what?" As if I didn't know.
But he was plainly very reluctant to see it.
So he was pushing the fingertips across the cabinet table. I put my fingertips to it, stopped it, and I said, "Now look, you know more than anybody else that I have been excluded deliberately from running my eye over at various drafts of this sort of thing, and excluded at a very high level."
So he pushed it gently across the table. We talked more widely, and his advice as ever was useful, that he did not wish to be in a position where he had seen the framework document.
The Prime Minister's problems with the framework documents were only just beginning. Somebody had leaked a version to the Times.
They had got a story that they were going to run the next day about the framework document, and they set out what they were going to say, and it was very pernicious, implying that there was going to be a united Ireland.
The British and Irish governments have drawn up a document that brings the prospect of a united Ireland closer than it has been at any time since partition. By midnight, the Times story was all round the House of Commons.
If what was reported in the Times is what appears in the framework document, then it will split the Conservative Party wide open.
I was absolutely clear we had to kill that story as much as we could, as speedily as possible. So I asked the whips to summon every Conservative MP they could find around the House at that late hour and bring them to my room.
You know how you see in Victorian Prince of the Cabinet, people are all sort of standing up in rather elegant positions. Well, nobody was in a particularly elegant position. They were standing up because they had to. It was so crowded.
One after another, Conservative backbenchers accused John Major of betraying Ulster. And the next day, he had to face the House of Commons.
Why were the Ulster political representatives denied the opportunity to at least inject some degree of common sense and realism into the document?
He cannot expect any self-respecting unionist to sit down at a table if that is going to be on the agenda. That is the price he is paying to get a deal with Gerry Adams and the IRA.
John Major's majority was only 4. He could not ignore those of his backbenchers who took their cue from the Unionists.
Some token level of decommissioning was necessary in order to reassure opinion, not just the British government, but Unionist and House of Commons opinion, that the Provisional IRA were genuine about seeking a permanent peace.
John Major dispatched his Northern Ireland Secretary to provide this reassurance. On a visit to Washington, he laid down the crucial conditions Sinn Féin had to fulfill to enter all-party talks.
The actual decommissioning of some arms as a tangible confidence-building measure and to signal the start of a process. Mr. Secretary, that's how Sinn Féin can remove their self-imposed disqualification and take their place at the talks table where a lasting settlement can be negotiated.
What he put forward was a recipe for complete and absolute disaster.
1 week later, Gerry Adams was in Washington for St. Patrick's Day. Adams explained to his American allies why the British demand would cause trouble.
Gerry was saying, decommissioning is in the hands of the IRA. When you tell me, in order to do politics, I have to get the IRA to do something, you tell me to kick a sleeping dog. Why are you doing that? In other words, let the dog sleep and let's do politics. And the better the politics get, the sleepier the dog is.
In July 1995, British ministers travelled secretly to Derry to meet the Sinn Féin leaders.
I said, well, we're hung up still on decommissioning, and it is a matter of great importance to the people whom we represent, and great importance to the people of Ireland generally.
The people of Ireland weren't hung up, as he had said, on the issue, that in fact the issue, in our opinion, was being injected into the process in an effort to prevent inclusive negotiations.
And they said, well, you know very well, of course, that we have nothing to do with the power of the IRA. We're quite separate. And I just looked at them and waited to see what they were going to say next. And they went on. And I made it perfectly clear, without having to say so, that in my mind the words "pull the other one" were present.
We came away with a very distinct view that this government in London wasn't for doing the business.
It appeared that the British just didn't seem to be happy with the ceasefire, but they wanted complete and total capitulation of the IRA.
That was developing into a huge crisis within the party because, you know, effectively the leadership of the party, which was a very strong leadership and a very experienced leadership, was being proved wrong.
The Irish government tried to alert the British to the gravity of the crisis facing Sinn Féin.
I said to Paddy Mayhew that these guys are under pressure, under extreme pressure, and that we had to be seen to be doing something. The British government, relying on the unionists, seemed to be like the rabbit stuck in the middle of the road in front of the headlights, and we were looking for some creative thinking. You know, if there was a huge roadblock, we couldn't go through it, so we had to find some way of going around it.
The way around the roadblock was to come from an unexpected quarter. July in Northern Ireland saw the climax of the marching season, as the Protestants commemorated their ancient victories over Catholics and asserted their right to march the Queen's Highway. In the summer of 1995 at Drumcree, the Orange Order tried to march their traditional route past the Catholic residents of the Gavahi Road.
That situation just came upon us out of the blue. We found, as we were coming out of church, that the walk was stopped by the police.
The risk of violence had led the police to ban the march. Trimble helped to broker a compromise, a silent march down the Gavahi Road. But when they reached the centre of town, the march was anything but silent.
We're delighted to be back down the traditional route, as we expect to be again.
When the Reverend Ian Paisley edged forward to claim credit for this victory, David Trimble moved in quickly and seized his hand, and something of his reputation.
I was the member for the area. He was there as well, and I did not wish to see myself being upstaged by him.
Trimble's performance at Drumcree earned him the support of hardliners. It helped him 2 months later to win the leadership of the Ulster Unionist Party. But the new leader soon surprised everyone. He broke a unionist taboo by going to Dublin. There he met the new Taoiseach, John Bruton, who also adopted a fresh approach.
The role that I had to undertake was not just one of keeping the Republicans on board and on ceasefire, it was also one of creating conditions in which the unionists would be willing to sit down with them.
Trimble proposed a way to do just that: elections.
I put it to John, pointing out how the unionist parties, not just ourselves, but the DP as well, were clearly on record of saying that they would, of course, engage with people in the context of an elected body.
That, to my mind, was quite a creative approach.
Bruton seized the first opportunity to pitch the idea to the British Prime Minister.
John Major and I were attending one of the informal EU summits in Formentor in Mallorca. It's a very salubrious resort, miles away from anything and anyone. So to have our press conferences with the media, we had to travel somewhat down market to a distant location.
You got my briefcase as well? And we sat next to one another on the bus. And we were chatting about Northern Ireland, a range of different issues. He saw the possibility of getting Sinn Féin and the Unionists sitting down and talking before there was decommissioning, which was a very attractive proposition from his point of view.
I felt that if a unionist vehicle, namely elections, could be used to carry nationalist baggage, which was all party talks without prior decommissioning, that the unionists would have greater ownership of the talks because it was their vehicle that got everyone there.
John Major filed the election idea away for later use in case his first preference, decommissioning before talks, proved impossible. In Northern Ireland, the ceasefire was holding, and old hatreds were suspended as Belfast prepared to welcome a visitor.
Moment. Tens of thousands of people there, and both Protestants and Catholics. But it was dark. So it's like they could all come out together to celebrate Christmas and hear a speech because nobody really knew who was there.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. Merry Christmas, and God bless you all.
In the cold light of day, it fell to the President's former advisor on Northern Ireland, Senator George Mitchell, to take up the grinding task of peacemaker. The British and Irish governments asked him to assess whether there was any way to get the paramilitaries to decommission. Mitchell's team took evidence from the key players in Northern Ireland. After 6 weeks, they discussed their preliminary findings with the Prime Minister, who still insisted the IRA must start to decommission before Sinn Féin could enter talks.
It seemed to us that prior decommissioning was not going to work. We'd been told that by almost everyone we talked to.
Mitchell's team reported what they had learned from the Royal Ulster Constabulary.
I asked the Chief Constable if Gerry Adams wanted to, could he get prior decommissioning from the IRA? And the Chief Constable said, no, he couldn't. He said he doesn't have that much control, and they wouldn't do it.
I didn't accept that the IRA couldn't decommission before all-party talks, but I did realise that they wouldn't decommission before all-party talks.
We were thinking about recommending parallel decommissioning. He made it clear that he didn't think much of that idea.
Nevertheless, when George Mitchell produced his report, he did recommend decommissioning in parallel with all-party talks. Major conferred with his advisers.
I said we're facing two negatives. For the Unionists, there is to be no progress without prior decommissioning. And for the Nationalists, there's to be no decommissioning without all-party talks. The only route that I can discover through those two incompatible positions was to have an elected assembly in which they would sit down together.
We believe that in the light of the Mitchell report, there are two ways in which all-party negotiations can now be taken forward. The first is for paramilitaries to make a start to decommissioning before all-party negotiations. They can, if they will. If not, the second is to secure a democratic mandate for all-party negotiations through elections specially for that purpose.
John Major calculated that an elected assembly, David Trimble's idea, would get the Unionists to sit down with Sinn Féin. But he gave no firm date for the negotiations, provoking the suspicion that his purpose was to appease the Unionists.
And it would be particularly irresponsible for a government to try to buy votes in this House to keep itself in power. To keep itself in power.
I couldn't understand the slowness in bringing the parties round the table. And I certainly couldn't understand why it was necessary to get an election, because an election would only harden up the political attitudes and make negotiations much more difficult.
And would he now fix a date for all-party talks rather than the 17 months that he has wasted up till now. And could I live with it, you don't.
John Hume's exasperation was justified. He knew that for Sinn Féin and the IRA, after a year and a half of ceasefire, the waiting was becoming unbearable.
The euphoria was given away to despair. And I think people were only asking, they were counting the days when the ceasefire was going to end. And I think it would be true to say they weren't saying if the ceasefire ends, it was when it was going to end.
When it became obvious to me that the process was not just in terminal decline, but in fact was all but over, I conveyed that to the Irish government and to the White House.
I took the call and he had disturbing news. I pressed him and tried to find out more about what this disturbing news was. He clearly did not want to discuss it, became still more tense during the conversation, which was relatively brief, and then he terminated the conversation before I could press him even further.
The ceasefire was over. Within hours of Adam's phone call, an IRA bomb in London's Docklands killed 2 and caused £86 million worth of damage.
It was a really strange sensation to see the televisual pictures of Canary Wharf and to have that sense that we had lost something, that the British had just made a complete and absolute mess of it. Now, obviously, the IRA have to take responsibility for its actions, but I remember having almost an out-of-body experience that your worst sort of fears have come true.
My first thought upon hearing of this news was simply despair. Were we really going to go back to what had happened for so many years?
4 months later, a huge bomb in Manchester answered the Prime Minister's question. The elections for all-party talks still went ahead. Sinn Féin won 15% of the vote, their biggest ever electoral success. But because the IRA had abandoned their ceasefire, Sinn Féin were locked out of the negotiations. Without Sinn Féin, could there be a peace process?